The gunshot echoed through the valley like a thunderclap, sending a flock of startled ravens into the crimson sky as Harlan Frost knelt in the dust, blood seeping between his fingers as he cradled his brother's lifeless body. The year was 1876, and death had come calling in the unforgiving Colorado territory once again. "I should have been here," Harlan whispered, his voice cracked and brittle as the parched earth beneath him. His younger brother James had been all he had left in this world, and now even he was gone, victim to a gang of outlaws who had left nothing but death in their wake. The settlement of Redemption Creek had little to offer in the way of comfort. A dusty main street lined with weathered buildings, a saloon that served more brawls than whiskey, and people who minded their own troubles. That suited Harlan just fine. He hadn't come looking for comfort. He had come looking for vengeance. 3 days after burying his brother, Harlan stood at the makeshift grave on the hillside overlooking the town. His once youthful face had hardened into a mask of determination, his blue eyes cold as river stones in winter. At 32, his dark hair was already showing threads of silver at the temples, each one earned through loss that had become his constant companion. "I will find them," he promised the fresh-turned earth. "Every last one." The wind carried his words away, sweeping them across the wild landscape as Harlan turned and walked back toward town, each step heavy with purpose. His brother's Colt revolver hung at his hip, an unfamiliar weight that he was determined to master. Redemption Creek had one saving grace: the local boarding house run by Delia Ramsey. At 28, she'd already weathered more storms than most. After losing her husband to typhoid 2 years prior, she'd transformed their modest home into a place where weary travelers could find a clean bed and a hot meal. Her cooking had become legendary in these parts, bringing a sliver of civilization to the harsh frontier. Harlan had taken a small room at the boarding house upon his arrival, speaking little and eating less. Each morning he would ride out, tracking the gang that had murdered his brother, and each evening he would return covered in dust and disappointment. The gang had vanished like morning mist, leaving no trail for him to follow. On this particular evening, Harlan entered the boarding house later than usual. The dining room was empty, the other boarders having finished their meals and retired to their rooms, or to the saloon for entertainment. He hung his hat on the rack by the door, his movements mechanical. "I was beginning to think you weren't coming back tonight," came a soft voice from the kitchen doorway. Delia stood there, wiping her hands on her apron. Her auburn hair was tied back in a practical knot, though a few rebellious strands had escaped to frame her face. Her green eyes reflected the lamplight as she studied him. "Sorry for the trouble," Harlan muttered, making to move past her toward the stairs. "It's no trouble to keep a plate warm," she replied, stepping back into the kitchen. "Come and eat something. You look half dead on your feet." Harlan hesitated, then followed her. The kitchen was warm, filled with the comforting aroma of freshly baked bread and stew. His stomach growled, reminding him that he hadn't eaten since dawn. Delia placed a steaming plate before him at the small kitchen table, then poured him a cup of coffee. "Sit," she instructed, in a tone that suggested she was used to being obeyed. Too tired to argue, Harlan sat. The first bite of stew nearly undid him, rich with herbs and vegetables from Delia's garden behind the house. It tasted like something from another life, a life before grief had hollowed him out. "You won't find what you're looking for by starving yourself," Delia said, sitting across from him with her own cup of coffee. "And what am I looking for, Mrs. Ramsey?" Harlan asked, his voice low. "Peace," she answered simply. "Or maybe just a reason to keep going." Harlan's spoon paused halfway to his mouth. "I have my reason." Delia's gaze was steady, unflinching. "Revenge isn't a reason, Mr. Frost. It's just another kind of death." Harlan continued eating in silence, unwilling to engage further, but Delia's words followed him up to his small room later that night, echoing in his mind as he cleaned his brother's revolver by lamplight. The following morning, Harlan descended the stairs to find the house unusually quiet. The other boarders, a traveling salesman, an elderly schoolteacher waiting for the schoolhouse to be completed, and a young couple heading west to seek their fortune, were all absent from the breakfast table. Delia moved about the kitchen with practiced efficiency, setting out a plate of eggs, bacon, and biscuits for him. "They've all gone to see the new doctor who's arrived in town," she explained. Apparently, he's quite the novelty-educated back east and everything. Harlan grunted in acknowledgement as he took his seat. Town could use a proper doctor. Indeed it could, Delia agreed. Perhaps you might want to have him look at that wound on your arm. Harlan glanced down at his left arm, where a dark stain had seeped through his shirt sleeve. He'd caught it on a nail the previous day while searching an abandoned homestead, but had thought little of it. It's nothing, he said dismissively. Delia raised an eyebrow. Infection out here isn't nothing, Mr. Frost. Men have lost limbs for less. Before Harlan could respond, the front door burst open and the sound of multiple boots filled the entryway. Harlan's hand instinctively moved to his holster. Mrs. Ramsey, called a deep voice. We need help. Delia rushed into the dining room, Harlan close behind her. Sheriff Thomas Miller stood in the doorway, supporting a young man whose face was pale with pain, blood soaked through his shirt at the shoulder. Billy caught a stray bullet out at the Henderson place, the sheriff explained. The new doctor's been called to a birthing up at the Nelson farm. Can you help? Bring him to the kitchen, Delia instructed without hesitation. Mr. Frost, fetch my medicine box from the pantry, the wooden chest on the top shelf. The next hour passed in a blur of activity. Delia worked with calm efficiency, cleaning and dressing the young man's wound while Harlan assisted as best he could, following her clipped instructions. The bullet had gone clean through, missing anything vital, but the blood loss had been significant. Once the young man was stabilized and resting on a cot in the kitchen, Sheriff Miller pulled Harlan aside. You've been asking questions about the Blackwood gang, the sheriff said, his voice low. Harlan nodded. They killed my brother. They've killed a lot of men, the sheriff replied grimly. And they'll kill you too if you keep on this path. They're not just ordinary outlaws. They're organized, ruthless. I'm not looking to bring them to justice, Sheriff, Harlan said coldly. I'm looking to end them. The sheriff studied him for a moment. I've seen that look before, on dead men. He sighed heavily. If you're determined to go after them, at least know what you're facing. There's talk they've holed up near the abandoned mining camp at Eagles Pass, but you didn't hear that from me. With a nod to Delia, the sheriff departed, leaving Harlan standing in the kitchen doorway, watching as Delia wiped blood from her hands with a damp cloth. You heard? He asked. I did, she replied without looking up. And I think the sheriff is right. Those men will kill you, and what will that accomplish? Your brother will still be gone. But they won't be able to hurt anyone else, Harlan countered. Delia finally raised her eyes to meet his. And is that your burden to bear alone? Are you the only one who can stop them? No one else seems willing to try. Perhaps because they value their lives, she said softly. Perhaps because they understand that sometimes the best revenge is to live well, despite what's been taken from you. Harlan felt a flicker of anger. Easy words from someone who hasn't lost what I have. The moment the words left his mouth, he regretted them. Delia's face went still, her eyes hardening. My husband died in my arms, Mr. Frost, she said, her voice quiet but firm. I held him as the fever took him, as he gasped for every breath. I buried him, and then I kept living. Not because it was easy, but because it was necessary. She turned away, reaching for a clean towel. So, don't presume to know what I have or haven't lost. Harlan stood speechless, watching as she tended to the wounded young man. Her hands were steady, her movements assured, but he could see the tension in her shoulders, the rigid set of her spine. I'm sorry, he said finally. That was uncalled for. Delia nodded once, accepting his apology without looking at him. If you're determined to go to Eagles Pass, at least let me dress that arm properly before you leave. Harlan hesitated, then rolled up his sleeve, revealing the angry red gash along his forearm. Wordlessly, Delia cleaned the wound, applied a salve that stung like fire, and wrapped it in clean linen. Thank you, Harlan said when she finished. Don't make me waste good bandages, Mr. Frost, she replied, a hint of softness returning to her voice. Try to come back alive. The ride to Eagles Pass took the better part of 2 days. The abandoned mining camp was nestled in a narrow canyon, the dilapidated buildings barely visible from the ridge where Harlan made his camp. Through his spyglass, he counted 5 men moving about the main structure, once the mining company office, now serving as the outlaws' hideout. Patience had never been Harlan's strong suit, but grief had taught him to wait. He watched the camp for a full day, Noting their routines, their guard changes, the way they moved and interacted, he recognized one of them from the descriptions he'd gathered: Marcus Blackwood himself, the leader of the gang, a tall man with a distinctive scar running from his right eye to his chin. As night fell on the second day, Harlan made his move. He left his horse tethered a safe distance away and made his way down to the camp on foot, keeping to the shadows. A storm was brewing in the distance, thunder rumbling across the mountains like a warning. He took out the first guard silently, with a rock to the back of the head. The second fell to a quick, efficient knife thrust before he could raise the alarm. Harlan had never considered himself a violent man before his brother's death, but now he moved with the cold precision of a predator. The main building was lit by oil lamps, casting long shadows through the dirty windows. Through a gap in the curtains, Harlan could see 3 men playing cards at a table, bottles of whiskey within easy reach. Blackwood was among them, laughing at something one of his men had said. Harlan's hand tightened on his brother's revolver. So close now. All he had to do was kick in the door and start shooting. 3 against 1, not good odds, but he'd had worse. And even if he died, he'd take Blackwood with him. His finger curled around the trigger as he moved toward the door. 1 step, 2. The wooden porch creaked beneath his weight. Inside, the laughter stopped. "Check that," came Blackwood's voice, sharp and commanding. Harlan pressed himself against the wall beside the door, heart hammering in his chest. The door swung open, and one of the outlaws stepped out, gun drawn. Harlan struck like a rattlesnake, driving his knife into the man's throat before he could cry out. But the dying man's pistol discharged as he fell, the shot deafeningly loud in the quiet night. Chaos erupted inside the building. Harlan kicked the door fully open and fired twice in rapid succession, dropping the second outlaw where he stood. Blackwood, however, was already in motion, diving behind an overturned table as he returned fire. The bullet grazed Harlan's cheek, hot pain streaking across his face. He ducked behind a support beam as Blackwood continued to fire. "Who the hell are you?" Blackwood called out when his gun clicked empty. "James Frost was my brother," Harlan answered, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. There was a moment of silence, then a bark of laughter. "The prospector? That sniveling coward begged for his life, you know, offered us everything he had." White-hot rage surged through Harlan. He stepped out from behind the beam, firing as he moved. His first shot went wide, splintering the wood beside Blackwood's head. His second caught the outlaw in the shoulder, spinning him around. Blackwood staggered but didn't fall. He lunged for a shotgun propped against the wall, swinging it toward Harlan with his good arm. Harlan fired again, the bullet striking Blackwood's chest. The outlaw's finger tightened reflexively on the shotgun's trigger as he fell, the blast deafening in the confined space. Pain exploded in Harlan's side as the shotgun pellets tore through him. He stumbled, falling to one knee, but kept his revolver trained on Blackwood, who lay gasping on the floor, blood spreading across his shirt. "You got what you wanted," Blackwood coughed, blood bubbling at his lips. "Feel better now?" Harlan stared at the dying man, the revenge he'd sought for so long now within his grasp. One more shot would end it. Justice for James. Peace, perhaps, for himself. But as he looked into Blackwood's fading eyes, Harlan felt nothing but emptiness. No satisfaction, no relief, just the same cold grief he'd been carrying since finding his brother's body. "No," Harlan answered truthfully. "I don't feel better at all." Blackwood's lips twisted in a bloody smile. "That's the thing about revenge," he wheezed. "Never quite what you expect." His eyes glazed over, fixed on something Harlan couldn't see, and then he was gone. The silence that followed was absolute. Harlan slumped against the wall, pressing his hand to his wounded side. The shotgun blast had caught him at an angle, the damage not immediately fatal, but serious enough. Blood seeped between his fingers, hot and steady. Outside, the storm had arrived, rain beginning to patter against the roof. Harlan dragged himself to his feet, pain shooting through him with every movement. He needed to get back to his horse, back to Redemption Creek, back to... Delia's face swam in his vision as he stumbled out into the rain. Her words echoed in his mind. Sometimes the best revenge is to live well, despite what's been taken from you. He'd had his revenge, but James was still dead. And now? As the rain mixed with the blood running down his side, Harlan wondered if he might be joining his brother sooner rather than later. The journey back to Redemption Creek was a blur of pain and determination. Somehow, Harlan stayed in the saddle, though consciousness came and went like the passing landscape. By the time he reached the outskirts of town, night had fallen again, and his horse was lathered with exhaustion. He barely remembered dismounting in front of the boarding house, stumbling up the steps, his hand leaving bloody smears on the whitewashed railing. He collapsed against the door, his strength finally giving out as he raised his hand to knock. The door opened before his knuckles could make contact, and he fell forward into waiting arms. "I knew you'd come back," Delia's voice reached him through the fog of pain. "Though you've certainly made a mess of yourself in the process." "Blackwood," Harlan managed to say as she helped him inside, "he's dead." "And nearly took you with him, by the looks of it," Delia replied, her calm voice belying the worry in her eyes. "Can you make it to the kitchen?" With her support, Harlan staggered to the kitchen table, the same one where she had treated the young man days before. As he collapsed onto a chair, he noticed the room was empty save for them. "Other boarders?" he asked through gritted teeth as Delia cut away his bloodied shirt. "I sent them to the hotel for a few days," she explained, examining his wound with careful fingers. "Said I needed to do some repairs. I had a feeling you'd be coming back in no state for company." Harlan hissed in pain as she began cleaning the shotgun wounds. "How did you know I'd come back at all?" Delia's hands paused briefly. "I didn't. I hoped." She met his gaze steadily. "There's a difference." The next hours passed in a haze of pain and fevered dreams. Delia worked tirelessly, removing shotgun pellets, cleaning and dressing the wounds. At some point, the new doctor arrived, summoned by Delia when she realized the extent of Harlan's injuries. "He's lost a lot of blood," the doctor said after his examination. "But if infection doesn't set in, he has a fighting chance. You did good work, Mrs. Ramsey." "Will you stay with him tonight, doctor?" Delia asked. "I've done what I can, but—" "You've done more than most trained physicians could," the doctor assured her. "But yes, I'll stay. Between the two of us, we'll see him through till morning." Morning came, and with it, a break in Harlan's fever. He awoke to find himself in a bed, not his small rented room, but what appeared to be Delia's own bedroom. Sunlight filtered through lace curtains, casting patterns across a quilt stitched with intricate designs. "Welcome back," came Delia's voice from beside the bed. She sat in a rocking chair, a book open in her lap, dark circles beneath her eyes, suggesting she had slept little, if at all. "How long?" Harlan's voice was a rasp, his throat dry as desert sand. 3 days, Delia answered, setting aside her book to pour him a glass of water from a pitcher on the nightstand. "You gave us quite a scare. Dr. Morris wasn't sure you'd pull through that first night." Harlan accepted the water gratefully, the cool liquid soothing his parched throat. "Why are you doing this? Taking care of me?" Delia adjusted the quilt over his chest, her movements gentle but efficient. "Because someone should. Because no one deserves to suffer alone." She met his gaze directly. "And because I've seen too much death in this town. It would be nice to save someone for a change." "Even someone like me?" Harlan asked. "A killer?" "I don't think that's who you are, Mr. Frost," she replied. "I think that's who grief tried to make you." She stood, smoothing her skirts. "Rest now. The doctor will be back to check on you this afternoon." As she turned to leave, Harlan reached out, catching her hand. "Harlan," he said. "My name is Harlan." A small smile touched Delia's lips. "Rest, Harlan. We can talk more when you're stronger." The days of recovery that followed were a strange mixture of pain and unexpected peace. Confined to bed on the doctor's orders, Harlan had little to do but think about James, about Blackwood, about the emptiness that revenge had left in its wake. Delia moved around him with quiet efficiency, bringing meals, changing bandages, reading aloud from her small collection of books, when the silence grew too heavy. The other boarders had returned, but they gave Harlan's room a wide berth, either out of respect for his recovery or fear of the man who had single-handedly taken down the notorious Blackwood gang. A week after his return, Sheriff Miller paid a visit, his expression grave as he sat in the chair beside Harlan's bed. "Found what was left of Blackwood and his men," the sheriff said without preamble. "Quite a mess you left up there." "They won't be troubling anyone else," Harlan replied, meeting the sheriff's gaze steadily. Miller nodded slowly. "No, they won't. And for that, a lot of folks around these parts are grateful. The governor's office has had a bounty on Blackwood for years." He reached into his coat and withdrew an envelope. $500. It's yours by rights." Harlan stared at the envelope, remembering Blackwood's dying words. The money wouldn't bring James back. It wouldn't fill the emptiness inside him. "Give it to Mrs. Ramsey," he said finally, "for her care and trouble." The sheriff's eyebrows rose in surprise. "That's generous of you." "No," Harlan corrected him. "It's just right." After the sheriff left, Delia entered with a tray of food. Her expression suggested she had overheard at least part of the conversation. "You shouldn't have done that," she said, setting the tray on the bedside table. "That money was yours." "I didn't go after Blackwood for money," Harlan replied. "And I've caused you enough trouble. Consider it payment for room and board." "It's far too much for that." "Then use it however you see fit. The boarding house could use some repairs, couldn't it?" Delia studied him for a long moment. "You're not staying, are you? Once you're healed?" The question caught Harlan off guard. He hadn't thought beyond recovery, beyond the next day or hour. The future had been a luxury he hadn't allowed himself since James's death. "I don't know," he answered honestly. "I haven't thought about it." "Perhaps you should," Delia said, her voice soft but firm. "A man needs purpose, Harlan. Something more than revenge." As another week passed, Harlan's strength gradually returned. He began taking short walks around the house, then into the garden behind it, where Delia grew vegetables and herbs for her kitchen. The fresh air and sunshine did him good, chasing away the lingering shadows of his convalescence. One afternoon, he found Delia kneeling in the garden, harvesting tomatoes. The summer sun had brought a flush to her cheeks, and tendrils of auburn hair had escaped her practical bun. She looked up as his shadow fell across her. "You're moving better today," she observed, setting a ripe tomato in her basket. "Dr. Morris says I'm healing well," Harlan replied. "Thanks to your care." Delia smiled, a quick upward turn of her lips that transformed her face. "I'm glad to hear it." Harlan hesitated, then gestured to the garden. "Could I help?" Surprise flickered across Delia's features, quickly replaced by warm approval. "Of course. There are beans that need picking on the trellis there." They worked side by side in companionable silence, the simple task soothing in its ordinariness. Harlan found himself noticing things he had been too consumed with grief to see before: the way the sunlight filtered through the cottonwood trees, the distant call of meadowlarks, the scent of earth and growing things. "Did you always want to run a boarding house?" he asked as they carried their harvest back toward the kitchen. Delia considered the question. "No, not particularly. Edward, my husband, and I had planned to open a proper restaurant. He was a fine cook, trained in New Orleans." A shadow of old grief crossed her face. "After he died, the boarding house seemed the most practical option. I had the space, and travelers always need somewhere to stay." "You're good at it," Harlan said, "making people feel welcome." "Even surly, revenge-seeking cowboys?" Delia asked, a teasing note in her voice. Harlan felt a smile tug at his lips, the first real smile in longer than he could remember. "Especially those, it seems." That evening, as summer twilight lingered in the sky, Harlan sat on the front porch of the boarding house. The town was settling in for the night, lamps being lit in windows, the distant piano from the saloon providing a tinny accompaniment to the crickets' chorus. The door opened behind him, and Delia emerged with 2 cups of coffee. She handed one to Harlan before taking the seat beside him. "Beautiful evening," she remarked, blowing gently on her coffee. Harlan nodded, watching as the first stars appeared above the mountains. "I'd forgotten," he said quietly. "Forgotten what?" "How to notice such things. Beauty. Peace." He turned to look at her. "Thank you for reminding me." Delia's expression softened. "You remind yourself, Harlan. I just provided the opportunity." They sat in silence for a time, sipping their coffee as darkness settled fully over Redemption Creek. When Delia finally spoke again, her voice was thoughtful. "What will you do now that Blackwood is gone and James is at rest?" Harlan had been asking himself the same question with increasing frequency. The emptiness that had followed his revenge was gradually being filled with something else, something quieter but no less powerful. "I've been thinking about that," he admitted. "There's not much waiting for me back east. Our parents died years ago, and the family farm was sold to pay their debts. So you have no home to return to?" "No." The word hung between them, simple but laden with meaning. "But I've been watching the town. There's no carpentry shop here, is there?" Delia shook her head. "No, Mr. Peterson over in the general store sells some basic furnishings, but for anything custom, folks have to send to Denver." "I was a carpenter before," Harlan said. "It was my trade. James was the one with gold fever, always chasing the next strike. I just followed to keep an eye on him." Understanding dawned in Delia's eyes. "You're thinking of staying, of opening a shop here?" "If there's need for one," Harlan replied, suddenly uncertain. "If the town would have me." "The town would be fortunate," Delia said firmly, "and there's certainly need. The new schoolhouse alone could use a skilled carpenter's touch, not to mention this porch railing." She tapped the weathered wood, which wobbled slightly under her hand. "It's been on my list of repairs for months." Harlan felt something loosen in his chest, a tightness he hadn't even realized was there. "I could fix that tomorrow," he offered, "as a start." Delia's smile in the gathering darkness was like a benediction. "I'd like that very much." As summer gave way to autumn, Harlan made good on his word. He started with repairs around the boarding house, the porch railing, loose floorboards, a back door that had never quite closed properly. Word spread quickly in the small community, and soon he had more work than he could handle alone. He rented a small storefront on Main Street, converting it into a workshop. With the bounty money that Delia had insisted on returning to him, "For your fresh start," she had said firmly, he purchased tools and supplies. By the time the first snow dusted the mountains, Harlan Frost, carpenter, had become a fixture in Redemption Creek. The work was good, honest, and satisfying in a way that hunting Blackwood had never been. Each piece he crafted or repaired felt like a small act of creation, of building something rather than destroying. And then there was Delia. They had fallen into an easy rhythm, sharing breakfast and dinner at the boarding house, Harlan helping with chores and repairs in exchange for reduced rent. They spoke of everyday things, the weather, the town gossip, books they had read. Gradually, they began to share deeper things, memories, hopes, the quiet grief they both carried. On a crisp October evening, as they sat by the fire in the boarding house parlor, after the other residents had retired, Delia asked the question that had been growing between them. "Are you happy here, Harlan? In Redemption Creek?" Harlan looked up from the small wooden box he was carving a gift for Delia's birthday, though she didn't know it yet. The firelight caught the copper highlights in her hair, and something tightened in his chest that had nothing to do with his healed wounds. "I am," he answered, surprised to find it absolutely true. "More than I thought possible after James died." Delia nodded, her fingers working steadily at her mending. "I'm glad. The town has grown fond of you." "And you?" Harlan asked, setting aside his carving. "Have you grown fond of me as well?" The directness of the question brought a flush to Delia's cheeks, but she didn't look away. "I think you know the answer to that, Harlan Frost." He moved to sit beside her on the small sofa, taking her hand in his. Her fingers were warm, slightly calloused from work, real in a way that matched the life they had both built here. "I'd like to court you properly, Delia," he said softly, "if you're willing." Her smile was like sunrise after the longest night. "I've been waiting for you to ask." Their courtship progressed with the steady certainty of people who had already seen each other at their worst and found beauty there regardless. Harlan brought Delia small gifts, a carved hairpin, wildflowers gathered on his way home from work, a rocking chair crafted in secret hours at his workshop. Delia cooked his favorite meals, mended his shirts with tiny, perfect stitches, listened to his stories of the day with genuine interest. The town watched with approval, and not a little smugness, as if they had known all along what would develop between the grieving carpenter and the boarding house keeper. "About time," Sheriff Miller remarked one day as he watched Harlan escort Delia from church. "You two have been dancing around each other for months." Winter settled over Redemption Creek with a heavy blanket of snow. The mountains disappeared behind curtains of white, and the town turned inward, gathering around hearths and stoves against the biting cold. For Harlan, who had known only restless wandering for so long, the enforced stillness of winter was a gift. Time to be with Delia, to plan, to dream of a future he had once thought forever lost to him. On Christmas Eve, with snow falling gently outside the windows of the boarding house, Harlan knelt before Delia in the parlor. The other boarders had tactfully made themselves scarce, giving them a rare moment of privacy. "I know it hasn't been very long," Harlan began, his voice rough with emotion. "And I'm not the man I was when I first came here. That man was broken, consumed by grief and anger. You helped me find my way back to myself, Delia. You showed me that there could be life after loss." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small wooden box, the one he had been carving months ago. Inside, nestled on a bed of velvet, lay a ring. It was simple but elegant, a band of silver with a small pearl set in the center. "I can't promise that life will be easy," Harlan continued, "but I can promise that I will love you every day, with everything I am. Will you marry me, Delia?" Tears welled in Delia's green eyes, spilling over as she nodded. "Yes," she whispered, taking his face between her hands. "Yes, I will marry you, Harlan Frost." The kiss they shared was both a culmination and a beginning, sweet with promise and the certainty of chosen love. They were married on New Year's Day, 1877, in the small church that had been Harlan's first major project in town. The entire community turned out for the ceremony, filling the pews with a sea of smiling faces. Sheriff Miller stood as Harlan's best man, while the schoolteacher, Miss Thompson, served as Delia's matron of honor. As Delia walked down the aisle toward him, radiant in a gown of deep blue velvet, Harlan felt the last of his armor fall away. The grief he had worn like iron for so long had been softened by Delia's patient care, by her cooking that somehow reached the parts of him that hurt most deeply, by her quiet insistence that life could still be beautiful. "You look happy," she whispered as she reached him at the altar. "I am happy," he replied, taking her hands in his. "You make me happy." Their vows were simple, heartfelt promises of devotion and partnership. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, the cheer that went up from the congregation seemed to shake the very rafters of the church. The celebration afterward was held at the boarding house, transformed by Delia's touch into a wonderland of greenery and candlelight. There was food and music, dancing and laughter. The community coming together to celebrate not just a wedding, but a healing, the redemption that had given the town its name. Late that night, after the last guests had departed and they were finally alone, Harlan and Delia stood in the kitchen where so much of their story had unfolded. "What are you thinking?" Delia asked, her head resting against his chest as they swayed gently to music only they could hear. "I'm thinking about the first time I sat at that table," Harlan answered, nodding toward the kitchen table where she had once dressed his wounds. "You told me that revenge wasn't a reason to keep going. You were right." Delia looked up at him, her expression soft in the lamplight. "And what is your reason now?" Harlan brushed a strand of hair from her cheek, marveling at the journey that had brought them to this moment. "Love," he said simply. "Love is my reason now." Spring arrived in Redemption Creek with its usual riot of wildflowers and new beginnings. Harlan's carpentry business had grown to the point where he had taken on an apprentice young Billy, the same young man whose gunshot wound Delia had treated the previous summer. The boy had a natural talent with wood, and an eagerness to learn that reminded Harlan of his brother in happier times. Delia continued to run the boarding house, though with changes that reflected her new life. The room that had once been hers was now shared with Harlan, and the small bedroom where he had recuperated from his wounds had been converted into a sitting room for their private use. They had discussed children, both agreeing that they wanted a family. "But there's time," Delia had said with a smile. "Let's enjoy being husband and wife first." On a warm May morning, Harlan awoke to find Delia's side of the bed empty. He found her in the garden, already at work despite the early hour. The sunrise painted her in gold as she knelt among the new growth, her hands gently tending to fragile seedlings. "You're up early," he said, kneeling beside her in the soft earth. Delia looked up with a smile that held a secret. I couldn't sleep. Too much on my mind. Anything you want to share? She took his hand and placed it gently on her stomach. I think our family might be starting sooner than we planned. Joy bloomed in Harlan's chest, bright and overwhelming. You're sure? Delia nodded, her eyes shining. Dr. Morris confirmed it yesterday. We're going to have a baby, Harlan, by Christmas, if all goes well. He gathered her into his arms, heedless of the dirt on their hands, the morning dew soaking their clothes. I love you, he whispered against her hair. Both of you. As the months passed and Delia's pregnancy progressed, Harlan found himself building again this time, a cradle from the finest cherry wood he could find. He worked on it in the evenings, each stroke of the plane and touch of the sandpaper an act of love for the child they were waiting to meet. Delia watched his work with appreciation, her hand resting on the growing curve of her belly. It's beautiful, she said one evening, as Harlan applied the final coat of oil to the wood. Just like everything you make. Not everything, Harlan demurred, but this is special. The cradle was finished in October. As autumn painted the mountains in fiery hues of red and gold, Harlan placed it in their bedroom, ready for the little one who would soon fill their home with new life. As winter approached once more, Delia's time drew near. Harlan found himself torn between excitement and a deep, primal fear that he might lose this newfound happiness. He remembered all too well the fragility of life, how quickly joy could turn to sorrow. You're brooding again, Delia observed one evening as they sat by the fire. Her hands were busy with tiny garments for the baby, a pile of soft white flannel growing beside her. Just thinking, Harlan replied, attempting to sound casual. Delia set aside her sewing and reached for his hand. About James? He nodded, unable to hide the truth from her perceptive gaze. And my parents, and your Edward. So many people gone too soon. Ah. Understanding filled her voice. You're afraid. Terrified, Harlan admitted. What if something happens to you, or the baby? I don't think I could bear it. Delia squeezed his hand. That's the risk of loving, Harlan. It makes us vulnerable. But would you trade what we have now to avoid the possibility of pain? No, he answered without hesitation. Never. Then we face whatever comes together, Delia said firmly, as we have since you stumbled onto my porch half dead. Harlan brought her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her palm. How did I ever deserve you? It's not about deserving, she replied, with the wisdom that had drawn him to her from the beginning. It's about choosing. Every day we choose each other. That's what matters. December arrived with a vengeance, bringing blizzards that isolated Redemption Creek from the outside world for days at a time. Harlan found himself grateful that Dr. Morris lived in town, rather than out at one of the outlying farms. Just in case. On the night of December 15th, as a particularly fierce storm howled around the eaves of the boarding house, Delia shook Harlan awake. It's time, she said simply, her face calm despite the pain evident in her voice. What followed was the longest night of Harlan's life, longer even than the night he had ridden back from Eagle's Pass with his wounds bleeding freely. He paced the hallway outside their bedroom, as Dr. Morris and Miss Thompson attended to Delia, flinching at every cry that escaped through the closed door. Sheriff Miller arrived sometime after midnight, having heard the news from one of the boarders who had gone for the doctor. He pressed a flask into Harlan's hand without a word. Does it always take this long? Harlan asked after taking a fortifying sip. The sheriff shrugged. Wouldn't know. Never been blessed with children myself. But my sister has 5. And I remember my brother-in-law looking about as green as you do right now for each one. Dawn was breaking, pale light filtering through the snow-covered windows, when the door finally opened. Dr. Morris emerged, his shirt sleeves rolled up, a tired but satisfied expression on his face. Congratulations, Mr. Frost, he said, extending his hand. You have a son, a strong, healthy boy. Harlan felt his knees go weak with relief. And Delia? Tired, as you'd expect, but doing remarkably well. She's asking for you. Nothing could have prepared Harlan for the sight that greeted him when he entered the bedroom. Delia, propped up against pillows, her hair damp with exertion, but her face alight with a joy so profound it seemed to illuminate the room, and in her arms a small bundle wrapped in the blankets she had so carefully prepared. "Come meet your son," she said softly. Harlan approached as if in a dream, perching carefully on the edge of the bed. Delia shifted the bundle, revealing a tiny face with his father's dark hair and a button nose that was all Delia. "He's perfect," Harlan breathed, reaching out a tentative finger to touch the baby's cheek. The skin was softer than anything he had ever felt, like velvet or the petals of the first spring flowers. "Would you like to hold him?" Delia asked. With trembling hands, Harlan accepted the precious weight of his son. The baby stirred, his eyes opening briefly unfocused newborn blue, but already carrying a spark of awareness that stole Harlan's breath. "What shall we call him?" Delia asked, watching them with tired satisfaction. Harlan considered for a moment. "What about Edward James Frost?" he suggested. "For your husband and my brother, to honor those we've lost, even as we celebrate this new life." Tears welled in Delia's eyes. "It's perfect," she agreed. "Edward James it is." Young Edward James Frost, EJ, as he quickly came to be called, thrived in the loving household created by his parents. He had Harlan's dark hair and thoughtful nature, combined with Delia's green eyes and quick smile. From his earliest days he showed a fascination with his father's work, watching intently from a basket in the corner of the workshop as Harlan planed and sanded, cut and joined. The boarding house continued to prosper under Delia's careful management, becoming known throughout the territory as a haven of good food and comfortable accommodation. With the additional income from Harlan's carpentry business, they were able to expand, adding a new wing with 4 additional guest rooms. As EJ approached his 2nd birthday, Delia shared news of another blessing on the way. This time, the pregnancy progressed with less anxiety, both parents secure in the knowledge that they could weather whatever came their way. In the spring of 1880, Sarah Elizabeth Frost joined the family, a fair-haired, laughing baby who had her father wrapped around her tiny finger from the moment she was placed in his arms. Life in Redemption Creek settled into a rhythm marked by the changing seasons and the milestones of ill-growing children. Harlan's reputation as a craftsman spread beyond the boundaries of the small town, bringing commissions from as far away as Denver. Delia's cooking became similarly renowned, with travelers often planning their journeys to include a stay at the Frost boarding house, specifically for the experience of her table. But it was on ordinary evenings, with the children bathed and tucked into bed, that Harlan felt most keenly the miracle of his life. Sitting with Delia on the porch swing he had built for her 3rd wedding anniversary, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of purple and gold, he would sometimes be overcome by a gratitude so intense it bordered on pain. "What are you thinking?" Delia would ask, noting the expression on his face, and Harlan would pull her close, breathing in the scent of her hair still auburn, though now with threads of silver that matched his own. "I'm thinking about how close I came to missing this," he would reply honestly. "How grief nearly blinded me to the possibility of joy." "But it didn't," Delia would remind him, her head resting against his shoulder. "You found your way back." "You found me," Harlan would correct her. "You saw past the grief I wore like armor." "Like iron," Delia would say with a smile, remembering those early days. "You were so determined to stay broken." "And you were just as determined to fix me," Harlan would laugh, "with stew and cornbread and practical wisdom." "I just wanted to feed you," Delia would protest with mock indignation. "To soften what hurt so badly inside you." And Harlan would kiss her then, a kiss filled with the accumulated love of their years together, with the knowledge of all they had overcome and all they had built. "You did more than feed me," he would murmur against her lips. "You saved me." In the year 1890, as Redemption Creek celebrated its 20th anniversary as an incorporated town, a grand celebration was held in the town square. Tables groaned under the weight of food prepared by the town's women, with Delia's contributions taking pride of place. Music filled the air as couples danced on a wooden platform, constructed specifically for the occasion by Harlan and his now thriving workshop, which employed 5 apprentices in addition to Billy, who had become a partner in the business. EJ, now 13 and the spitting image of his father, helped organize games for the younger children, his natural leadership already evident. 10-year-old Sarah flitted about in a blue dress that matched her eyes, her golden braids bouncing as she moved from group to group, a social butterfly in the making. As twilight settled over the festivities, Mayor Thompson, formerly Miss Thompson the schoolteacher, now married to the town banker, called for attention. As we celebrate 2 decades of growth and prosperity in our beloved town, she announced, the town council has decided to honor 2 citizens who have contributed immeasurably to making Redemption Creek the thriving community it is today. Harlan and Delia Frost, would you please come forward? Surprised, Harlan and Delia made their way to the platform, where the mayor presented them with a framed certificate and a small bronze plaque. This plaque will be mounted on the town hall, Mayor Thompson explained, to commemorate your contributions to Redemption Creek, from Harlan's craftsmanship that built or repaired nearly every structure in town, to Delia's hospitality that has made our town a destination rather than just a way station. You have embodied the spirit of community that makes this place special. Applause erupted from the gathered townspeople, many of whom had known the Frosts since those early days when a grief-stricken man had arrived seeking vengeance and found healing instead. Harlan, never comfortable with public speaking, nevertheless felt moved to respond. When I came to Redemption Creek, he said, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet square, I was broken in ways I couldn't even recognize. I was looking for death, either Blackwood's or my own. I wasn't particular. A ripple of surprised laughter moved through the crowd. What I found instead was life, a new purpose, a home. He looked down at Delia, who stood beside him with tears shining in her eyes. And most importantly, love. The kind of love that heals what's broken and builds something stronger in its place. Delia squeezed his hand, then addressed the gathering herself. Redemption Creek has given us as much as we've given it, she said warmly. A place to belong, friends who became family, the chance to watch our children grow in safety and happiness. She glanced at EJ and Sarah, who were watching from the front row, pride evident in their young faces. We are honored by this recognition, but the true honor has been sharing these years with all of you. More applause followed as they left the platform, but it was the private words shared later that night, as they walked home hand in hand under a canopy of stars that Harlan would always remember. Did you ever imagine that first night when you were cleaning my wounds that we would end up here? He asked. Delia considered the question. Not specifically, she admitted, but I saw something in you, even then. A capacity for love that grief had buried but not destroyed. And now? Harlan stopped walking, turning to face her in the moonlight. At 46, Delia was more beautiful to him than ever, the passing years having added character and depth to her beauty, rather than diminishing it. Now, she said, reaching up to touch his face, the face she had first seen contorted with pain and rage, now softened by love and contentment. Now I can't imagine any other path. Every step, even the painful ones, led us exactly where we were meant to be. Harlan drew her close, the solid warmth of her a constant reassurance in a world that had once seemed so cold and empty. Together, he murmured against her hair. Together, Delia agreed, her arms tightening around him. Always. And as they continued their walk home, to the house that had once been just a boarding house but was now the heart of their family, Harlan reflected on the journey that had brought him here, from the dark days after James's death, through his pursuit of revenge, to the shotgun blast that should have ended his life but instead had redirected it. Every moment had been a step toward this life he now cherished. The grief he had once worn like iron had been softened by Delia's patient love, by her cooking that somehow reached the wounded places within him, by her whispered promise to heal what hurt so deeply. In its place had grown something stronger, a life built on love rather than loss, on creation rather than destruction. As they reached their front porch, light spilling from windows that held their children safe within, Harlan paused to look back at the town spread out below them. Redemption Creek, the place that had given him a second chance, the community that had embraced him despite knowing the darkness he had carried. "What is it?" Delia asked, noticing his contemplative expression. Harlan smiled, drawing her close once more. Just thinking that sometimes the things we think will destroy us are actually the beginnings of something beautiful. Delia's answering smile was all the confirmation he needed. "Come inside, Harlan," she said softly. "I made apple pie this afternoon." And with a heart full of gratitude for this woman who had seen beyond his grief to the man he could become, Harlan followed her into the warmth of their home, leaving the darkness behind.